Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what might be the most extraordinary stock market valuation I have ever seen. SpaceX has just completed the largest IPO in history. The company raised around $75 billion, was initially valued at around $1.8 trillion, and by the end of its first day of trading, investors had pushed that valuation above $2 trillion, with the shares closing at around $161 each. Now that's impressive enough on its own. But what really caught my attention is where that valuation places SpaceX in the global rankings. SpaceX is now the sixth most valuable company in the world. If you just think about that for the moment, this isn't the sixth largest aerospace company or technology company or the largest company in America. It's the sixth most valuable company on the entire planet. It now sits alongside companies such as Nvidia, Apple, Microsoft, Alphabet, and Amazon. And that's what makes this story so extraordinary, because those companies generate hundreds of billions of dollars of annual revenue. SpaceX generated less than 20 billion last year. Yet investors have decided that it deserves to sit at the same table as those other names. So the obvious question is, what exactly are investors seeing that justifies a valuation of more than $2 trillion? And the reason this matters isn't simply because it's an interesting story, which it is. It matters because once a company reaches this sort of size, it starts finding its way into investment portfolios all over the world, such as pension funds, your pension, investment funds, ETFs, index tracking products, wealth management portfolios. Millions of people who've never watched a rocket launch, never used Starlink, and have no interest in Elon Musk may eventually find themselves indirectly exposed to SpaceX. That's how modern financial markets work. The largest companies attract the largest flows of capital. So whether you ever buy a share in SpaceX or not, there is a reasonable chance that over time some of your savings, pension contributions, or investment funds could gain exposure to the company, which is why I think it's worth understanding what this business actually does, because at a valuation of more than $2 trillion, SpaceX is no longer a niche aerospace company. It's become one of the most important companies in global financial markets. Now, before we get into the details, could I ask anybody that hasn't subscribed yet to please hit that subscribe button? It really helps me with the YouTube algorithm and also puts a smile on my face. So let's talk about SpaceX. But before we get into discussions on rockets and satellites and artificial intelligence, I think we need to talk about Elon Musk, because I don't think you can understand this valuation without understanding the man behind the company. Elon Musk founded SpaceX in 2002 after making his first fortune through PayPal. PayPal helped transform online payments and was eventually sold to eBay for around $1.5 billion. Now, most entrepreneurs probably would have retired at that point, but Elon Musk did the exact opposite. He took much of the money that he made from PayPal and started investing into ideas that many people thought were unrealistic, such as Tesla and SpaceX, and later a number of other ventures, including Neuralink and the Boring Company. At the time, electric vehicles were considered niche products, and private rockets were considered almost impossible. Today, Tesla is worth around $1 trillion, and as we've just discussed, SpaceX is now worth more than $2 trillion. So whether you love Elon Musk or hate him, that is an extraordinary track record. And this is where the Elon Musk factor comes into play. Investors aren't just looking at a man who founded a rocket company. They're looking at somebody who's helped create PayPal, build Tesla into one of the most valuable companies in the world, transform the economics of space launches, and created a global satellite internet network serving millions of customers. Now that is a remarkable track record for one individual. So when Elon Musk starts talking about AI infrastructure, orbital company, and entirely new industries that don't exist yet, there are plenty of investors prepared to listen. Not because those ideas are guaranteed to be a success, but because history suggests that writing Elon Musk off completely can be a very expensive mistake. And that's really what this IPO is all about. The current business is impressive, but a valuation of more than $2 trillion suggests investors are already looking far beyond what SpaceX is today and focusing on what Musk believes it will become tomorrow. So let's start off with the basics. What exactly is SpaceX? Well, many people think it's a rocket company, and that's partly true, but it's also massively misleading. Saying SpaceX is a rocket company is a bit like saying Amazon sells cardboard boxes. The rockets are important, but they're really just the delivery system. The question is, delivery system for what? And the answer is satellites. Now, I think this is where a lot of people switch off and glaze over because they hear the word satellite and immediately think of something floating around in space that has absolutely nothing to do with their lives. The reality is actually quite different. A satellite is simply a machine placed into orbit around the Earth to perform a specific task. The interesting thing is that most of us use satellite services every single day without even thinking about it. GPS navigation relies on satellites. Weather forecasting also needs satellites. International aviation, if you're getting on a plane, that relies heavily on satellites. Global communication networks also rely upon them. Shipping companies need them for their navigation. Military relies on satellites, as does broadcasters. If you watch any TV, then it's going to involve some form of satellite. In fact, much of modern life quietly depends on infrastructure orbiting hundreds of miles above our heads. And somebody has to get all of that equipment into space. That's the business SpaceX originally built. Historically, the model was quite straightforward. A telecommunications company, a government agency, a scientific organization, or a commercial business would build a satellite and then hire SpaceX to launch it into orbit for them. SpaceX provided the rocket, and the rocket carried the payload into space, and SpaceX got paid for doing that. Very simple. But something very important has changed over the last few years. Increasingly, SpaceX isn't launching other people's equipment, it's launching its own. And that brings us to the most important part of the business, Starlink. This is the part of the story that surprised me the most. Most people think the rocket business is the biggest part of SpaceX. It isn't. The biggest part today is Starlink. Starlink generated around $11 billion of revenue last year. That's more than half of SpaceX's total revenue. The launch business generated around $4 billion. In other words, SpaceX generates almost 3 times more revenue from internet access than it does from launching rockets. That completely changes how you think about the company. This isn't primarily a rocket company, it's becoming a communications company. So what exactly is Starlink? Well, to put it simply, it's an internet company, but instead of delivering internet through fiber optic cables buried under roads or mobile phone towers built on land, it delivers internet from space. SpaceX has launched thousands of small satellites into low Earth orbit. Those satellites communicate with each other using laser links and together form a giant network surrounding the planet. If you're in the middle of the desert, on a remote island, on a ship crossing the ocean, or sitting on an aircraft at 35,000 feet, Starlink can still provide internet access. That's the genius of the system. And it's not just theory, I've actually experienced it myself. Recently I was on a flight equipped with Starlink and the connection was so good that I carried out 2 live streams on YouTube directly from the seat on the aircraft. Now, if you've travelled much over the last decade, you'll know how remarkable that is. Historically, aircraft internet was painfully slow. Sending an email was an absolute challenge. Video streaming was totally unrealistic. Live broadcasting like I did on YouTube would have been totally not feasible at all. Yet there I was thousands of feet above the Atlantic conducting live streams with viewers watching in real time. That's a pretty good illustration of how far the technology has become, and that's why Starlink is growing so quickly. The company now serves more than 10 million customers around the world. More importantly, Starlink generates recurring revenue. A rocket launch generates revenue once, you launch something, you get paid, job done. Starlink customers pay every month. They pay again next month and the month after that and the month after that. It's just like all of your bills. If you're paying for an internet provider, you can't switch that off, particularly if you've got kids, because they would go berserk if the broadband stopped working. And investors absolutely love recurring subscription revenue because it's predictable. And that's one of the reasons why so much value is now being assigned to Starlink. There's another reason as well. Most satellite companies have to pay somebody else to launch their satellites. SpaceX launches its own satellites. So it owns the rockets, it owns the satellite network, and it owns the customer relationship. Every time launch costs fall, Starlink becomes more profitable. The two businesses reinforce each other. That's an enormous competitive advantage. Now let's move on to the next part of the story, Starship. This is SpaceX's giant next generation rocket, the largest and most powerful rocket ever built. And this is where the story starts becoming much more speculative. SpaceX has already spent billions developing Starship. Why? Because the whole long-term vision depends on dramatically reducing the cost of getting things into space. The cheaper it becomes to launch equipment into orbit, the more viable entirely new industries become. And that's where we get into the AI story, because I don't think you can understand a 2 trillion valuation without talking about AI. Artificial intelligence requires enormous computing power. Computing power requires data centers, and a modern data center is essentially a giant warehouse filled with computers. Those computers consume vast amounts of electricity. They generate enormous amounts of heat and require cooling systems, power infrastructure, and large amounts of land. In many parts of the world, electricity availability is already becoming a constraint on AI expansion. Now, this is where the SpaceX story starts to sound like science fiction. One of the ideas increasingly being discussed is the possibility of building data centers in space. Before you immediately dismiss that as ridiculous, let's think about what's actually being proposed. Instead of building these facilities on Earth, you launch them into orbit. They are powered by solar panels and operate continuously in space, and they communicate with Earth through satellite networks such as Starlink. In effect, you're creating unmanned data centers floating above the Earth rather than building them on the ground. Imagine giant clusters of computer servers orbiting the planet, processing AI workloads 24 hours a day, powered by sunlight and connected back to users through satellite networks. That's the vision. The attraction is obvious: no land constraints, no planning battles, potentially unlimited solar energy, and theoretically, the ability to scale to levels that might eventually become difficult on Earth. But of course, there are huge questions. How do you maintain these data centers? How do you repair them? How do you upgrade them? What happens when hardware fails? What are the economics? Well, nobody really knows the answer to any of those questions, and that's why this part of the SpaceX story is so fascinating. Investors are already assigning value to an industry that doesn't exist today. This is where the valuation debate becomes really interesting, because the current business is impressive. Starlink is real, the launch business is happening, government contracts are there, military contacts exist. The future AI infrastructure story is a vision, and investors are paying today for that vision. One interesting detail from the IPO process is the use of a green shoe option by Morgan Stanley. In simple terms, this allows additional shares to be sold if demand remains exceptionally strong. If you think about it as releasing extra tickets when a concert sells out immediately, it's designed to stabilize the market and satisfy excess demand. And given the demand for this IPO, it's easy to see why that mechanism was included. So the green shoe mechanism is interesting and does explain why the share price is still going up, because there's still excess demand. But let's come back to the original question that we were asking. Is SpaceX actually worth more than $2 trillion? Well, if you think it's just a rocket company, then obviously the answer is no. If you think it's a global communications company, the valuation starts to become easier to understand. If you think it's going to become the infrastructure provider for the AI economy, then maybe investors are right. The problem is that much of that future doesn't really exist yet, and perhaps that's the most remarkable thing about this entire story. In the space of a single day, investors took a company generating less than $20 billion of annual revenue and elevated it into the ranks of the 6 most valuable companies on Earth. That's an extraordinary statement of confidence, because if you look at the business today, a lot of what justifies this valuation hasn't actually happened yet. And that's where Elon Musk comes back into the story. Investors aren't simply valuing the current business, they're placing a value on Musk's ability to execute ambitious projects and create entirely new industries. Effectively, they're betting that the same entrepreneur who created PayPal, transformed the electric vehicle market through Tesla, and revolutionized space launches through SpaceX can do it again. And perhaps that's why this IPO has attracted so much attention, because this isn't really a debate about rockets or satellites or even Starlink. It's a debate about whether the future that Elon Musk is describing actually will happen. If it does, today's valuation might actually look cheap. If it doesn't, history may look back on this as one of the most ambitious and optimistic valuations ever assigned to a public company. And that's why I think the SpaceX IPO is one of the most fascinating stories in the market right now. And hopefully you've enjoyed me sharing this information with you. If you did, then please give me a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much to everyone that's supporting me. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks or signed up as a patron or a member, thank you so much for that support. It really does help to keep me focused and making as many videos as possible.